And we are here today with two very exciting presenters, Dr. Katy Flannigan and Dr. Kaitlyn McLachlan. I want to share a little bit of background, first of all, just in terms of the topic that we're looking at today. We know it's a topic that's receiving a lot of attention, which is absolutely wonderful to see. When we think about FASD and the criminal justice system and the relationship that really exists between that, we really, when I think about Dr. Flannigan and Dr. McLachlan, I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say we could very well have the two foremost experts in the world as it pertains to FASD and the criminal justice system. And so we're thrilled to have them here today. And I just would invite Katy to introduce herself.
Yes, good morning. So I am Katy Flannigan. I'm so pleased to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation. As you mentioned, I have a very strong interest in FASD and the criminal justice system. So I currently am a research associate with the Canada FASD Research Network. And I'm also a registered psychologist in Alberta and BC. And I do a lot of work across the spectrum around intervention, assessment, and supports for people and families with FASD, but I really do have a special interest in this area, and this is where my graduate training was focused. So I am pleased to be here today.
Thank you very much. And Dr. McLachlan?
Good morning, everyone. It's nice to see some friendly faces and to meet some new faces as well. Thank you for the lovely introduction, Rob, and for the invitation to be here. These are some of my favorite get-togethers. So my name is Kaitlyn McLachlan. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Guelph in the Department of Psychology. I'm also a research lead for the Canada FASD Research Network, who is able to provide a lot of support for research in this area with a focus on justice. And I'm a member of the College of Psychologists of Ontario as a clinical psychologist, and also the College of Psychologists of British Columbia. And for quite some time now, my background is really in clinical and forensic psychology, looking at the intersection of mental health and neurodevelopmental disability and difficulty with the law. And a lot of my work and the folks I've been lucky enough to work with are really engaged in trying to best understand how it comes to be that vulnerable groups are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, risk and protective factors, and importantly, how to really inform with an evidence-based policy and intervention solutions to support folks having healthy outcomes. So welcome, everyone, and thanks for having us here today.
We're also thrilled to have the Speaker of the House from Queen's Park. Mr. Speaker, if you wanted to bring some greetings, we would appreciate it.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to join you today for this discussion about this important subject. And yes, I currently serve as the Member of Provincial Parliament for Wellington Halton Hills, first and foremost, and served in the legislature for 30 years now, and more recently as Speaker of the Legislative Assembly. So in that capacity, I suppose gives me the authority to bring greetings on behalf of all the members of the legislature from all the political parties who are these days working together more so on all of the challenges that we're facing, which I think everybody is pleased to see. And certainly fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is an issue that shouldn't be looked at through a partisan lens. It should be looked at as a challenge that we can confront together and set aside politics. I know that there have been many discussions about FASD in the legislature in recent years as well, and there will be again in the future. So I want to express my appreciation to all of you for the work that you're doing to advocate, and I look forward to working with you in the coming months towards solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. So we will go ahead and start our presentation at this point here in just a couple minutes. I just, again, wanted to share one other thing with you as to why we invited Dr. Flannigan and Dr. McLachlan to join us here today. As you know, there's lots of research and lots of attention being focused now on FASD and the criminal justice system. We just heard the province of Ontario announce last week how they've put additional funding toward our mobile crisis intervention teams, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing. We've seen the positive outcomes that come from that, even at our local area. We also were involved in a study done at a federal level where the Ministry of Justice contacted a lot of the support groups, contacted a lot of the community justice groups as well. And we're expecting a national report to be coming out here shortly. We do know that the report is done. It's just waiting to be released at this point, and we certainly hope that that's going to help move this forward as well. So at this point, we will go ahead and begin the presentation.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to be spending the next half an hour or so talking about the issue of FASD in the criminal justice system. But before we begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge that across Canada, we live and work on various treaty territories and traditional meeting grounds and homes of the Indigenous peoples. And I personally currently am situated on Treaty 6 territory in Edmonton, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to be covering today. So Kaitlyn is going to start us off with some kind of broad contextual information to help us understand the issue of FASD in the context of the criminal justice system. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about complexities and experiences and other factors that might relate to the criminal justice system involvement that we sometimes see in this population. And then finally, Kaitlyn is going to wrap us up and give some discussion points around ways that we can move forward in advancing practices and policies to better address and meet the needs of this population.
Thanks, Katy. I'm just going to share a little bit about the background and context for those who are a bit less familiar with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and to set the stage for why we're here talking to you today about the criminal justice system. So fetal alcohol spectrum disorder is a diagnostic term that's used to describe the wide-ranging impacts on both the brain and body that individuals with prenatal alcohol exposure experience across the lifespan. So this is a disability that can impact people lifelong, though the different kinds of areas of need and difficulties that they may experience may change with age and developmentally over time. Individuals with FASD experience a whole range of challenges and difficulties as a result, and require supports in those areas in order to achieve their best outcomes. And like all of us, they are unique and have their own unique strengths that can also be leveraged in order to support positive and healthy outcomes. FASD is a common neurodevelopmental disability, though the research remains a little bit limited in respect to being able to give us a really clear picture of how many people, for instance, in Canada or in Ontario may have FASD. At this stage, our best estimates are conservative and suggest that anywhere as many as 4% of people could have FASD in the Canadian context. So that translates to roughly 1.45 million people. FASD, given the types of complex services and needs and supports that are helpful in promoting healthy outcomes, can be a disability that has high social impact and financial costs. Some studies have estimated conservatively, again, that the lifetime cost to support one person with FASD ranges from between $1 and $2 million, and that across Canada annually those costs may range anywhere as high as between 1.8 and 9.7 billion dollars. This is an area, though, that additional research is really needed to inform our understanding of how many people may have FASD in Canada, and can inform policy and other kinds of decisions around putting the right supports in place for individuals and their families. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more specifically about FASD in the context of the criminal justice system. And it's really important to clarify here that certainly by no means will all or even most people with FASD experience this kind of difficulty in respect to having contact with police or the criminal justice system more formally. Though our early evidence and common concerns that I receive from care providers is that individuals with FASD do seem to experience elevated rates of police contact and may be overrepresented in correctional and forensic contexts.
So I'll start by saying that the data that we have in this area is pretty limited, and that many of the studies I'm going to share with you briefly now are based on data from one location at one point in time, and really can't be used to generalize or talk broadly about the experiences of people with FASD across the entire population, but rather in these unique settings. But a handful of studies at this stage conducted in specific correctional institutions in both youth and adults, and also forensic mental health settings. Those are settings where individuals are experiencing major mental health concerns and also criminal justice system contact, suggest that as many as 10% to 36% of people who participated in studies in those locations met diagnostic criteria for FASD when they were evaluated in research contexts. Other data have collected from people who went to diagnostic clinics in seminal early research in the 1990s conducted by Dr. Ann Struist-Guth and colleagues, found that as many as 60% of adolescents and adults with FASD had had some kind of contact with the criminal justice system. And taking all of these numbers together, epidemiologists have estimated that youth with FASD are 19 times more likely to be incarcerated compared to youth without FASD, and that rates of FASD in correctional settings may be 30 times greater as compared to rates in the general population. So while these data are considered preliminary, and we do need to do more research to understand if they really apply across settings, provinces, for instance, and populations, they do start to point toward the beginning of an evidence-based concern that individuals with FASD may be significantly overrepresented in these kinds of settings. So now I'm going to share with you findings from a study that we just published this year, together with my colleagues, including Dr. Flannigan here, that used data from the Canadian Dataform, or FASD database. This is a really terrific database that includes records from now over 3,000 people in Canada seen at diagnostic clinics, and where all the records are anonymized. That means we can't in any way identify who's been to a clinic, but it provides a really powerful data source for us to be able to understand from a Canadian perspective what people who are presenting to diagnostic clinics with a concern about prenatal alcohol exposure or fetal alcohol spectrum disorder are experiencing, both in terms of their clinical profiles, the kinds of needs and difficulties they have, and here in this study in particular, the kinds of difficulties they were experiencing in everyday living across the areas that you can see pictured here. And the reason I want to share this data with you today is because we do have some information about the number of folks who, at the time of their diagnostic assessment, when they were seen in clinic, had reported or were described as having been experiencing difficulties in respect to having committed an offense, as well as difficulties as legal difficulties as a victim, and difficulties associated with incarceration. So what did we find? Consistent with early studies from Washington and other places in the world, difficulties are very common, with high rates of difficulties for adolescents, transition-aged youth, and adults seen in Canadian FASD diagnostic clinics. I should have noted earlier that research of this nature focusing on adolescents, transitioned aged youth, so youth who are emerging and transitioning from adolescence into adulthood, as well as adults, remains quite limited in the field, and is really critical in order to be able to inform what kinds of needs individuals at these developmental stages experience in order to provide a good evidence-based perspective on how to provide resources and supports to ensure healthy transitions with supports for independence in adulthood. So findings from this study focused on a range of different kinds of areas of difficulty, but given the purpose of our talk today, I'll focus on difficulties related to legal problems with offending and incarceration. And as you can see, looking at adolescents, transition-aged youth, and adults, 33 to 36% of those who actually received an FASD diagnosis after being seen in clinic were experiencing those kinds of difficulties at the time that they were seen in clinic, and incarceration rates amongst adults ranged to as high as 10%, with an increase in the number of folks who were reporting incarceration at the time of their participation in the study being highest among adults as compared to youth. When we looked overall at the number of difficulties people were experiencing, we also found that individuals diagnosed with FASD had high rates of difficulties, with those diagnosed with FASD with and without the facial features that are less commonly presented by those with the disability, with the average number of difficulties ranging from between 2.5 to 3, and obviously a smaller subset of folks with FASD who were experiencing much higher rates of these complex difficulties. And if I just point back to this slide here, you can see that these findings really speak to the number of supports and resources that we need to start thinking about putting into place early in adolescence, in addition to the kinds of traditional interventions and services that we think about offering children, given how important some of these difficulties would be to maintain well-being in every day, such as maintaining independent employment and having the ability to earn an income, make meaningful contributions at work, live independently, and have safe and supportive housing depending on the unique needs of each individual.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. That was a great overview of some of the stats around the issue that we're talking about today, as well as some of the potential outcomes that can be experienced in this population. So now I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about some of the factors and the complexities that we suspect might contribute to some of these negative outcomes, and in particular, criminal justice system involvement. So for now, I'm going to talk about some of the literature and research with individuals in the broader FASD population, not those necessarily who have criminal justice system involvement. So we know that FASD is a brain-based disability that is associated with cognitive and behavioral challenges. Researchers have spent a lot of time studying and documenting some of these impairments that individuals with FASD tend to experience. So these are just a few of the brain-based vulnerabilities that we commonly see in this population. Now, compounding these brain-based cognitive and behavioral challenges that are well documented in the FASD population, people with FASD also experience remarkably high rates of adverse experiences, beginning in the earliest years of life and extending throughout the lifespan. So here are some of the examples of adversity that individuals with FASD have been reported to experience. Examples of early adversity include things like abuse and neglect, exposure to substance use in the home, exposure to parental criminality. Another common experience in early life for children with FASD is caregiving instability. So by this I mean residential disruption, so moving from placement to placement in the early years of life. As an individual with FASD gets older, they may experience higher rates of school problems, and not just learning and cognitive problems, but social problems or problems in terms of being suspended or expelled or dropping out entirely. This extends into employment challenges, and as Kaitlyn talked about earlier, problems with independent living and safe and stable housing, and again, this concept of trouble with the law. The third piece of the puzzle that I want to touch on in the general FASD population is this concept of comorbidity. We know from the research that people with FASD experience high rates of both physical and mental health conditions. So some researchers suggest that 90% or more of people with FASD experience an additional mental health diagnosis on top of their FASD. Also, suicidality and substance use are also concerningly common in this population. So this research with the broader FASD population gives us a really good handle on these kind of three components of complexity that may contribute to an increased likelihood that a person with FASD might come into conflict with the law. Now, there haven't been nearly as many studies that have specifically looked at whether and how these factors interact to specifically lead to a trajectory into the justice system, but there have been a small handful of studies that do document elevated rates of challenge in these various biopsychosocial factors. So as you can see, the situation is really very complex and very multifaceted, and ultimately these different areas of complexity increase the vulnerability of a person in terms of coming into contact with the justice system. So sometimes we might think of FASD as being relevant at just one point of contact with the justice system. So for example, when an individual is being arrested for an offense. But we believe that the needs and the difficulties that are experienced by many people with FASD are actually relevant throughout the justice process and at multiple points of contact. So for example, FASD or the challenges associated with FASD might be relevant at the questioning stage, or whether the individual understands or can waive their rights. It might also be relevant in terms of whether they understand and can meaningfully participate in their defense during a trial. It might be relevant in correctional facilities when programs are being delivered that may or may not adequately account for the unique challenges of a person with FASD. And it also is relevant in terms of how supports and supervision programs in the community following release can address or respond to the needs or challenges of this group. The problem is that there really isn't a whole lot of research at these various points of contact that allow us to inform policy or procedures or interventions for people with FASD. Where there is a little bit of research is in terms of risks and needs as they relate to criminal justice involvement. So Kaitlyn has done a bit of work in this area, and she has found with preliminary Canadian data that youth with FASD experience earlier contact with police than youth without FASD. They have higher levels of risk and lower levels of protective factors. They may be more likely to reoffend. They may have a higher number of offenses. They may reoffend more quickly than youth without FASD. They also have impaired, or can have, or tend to have more impaired psycholegal abilities than youth without FASD. They may have higher rates of transition to the adult system. And other research in the US has suggested that people with FASD also have experiences as victims of crime, and they may experience an elevated risk of victimization once they are taken into custody. Now, not a lot of the research that I have shared has incorporated the voices or the lived experiences of individuals with FASD. However, there are a small handful of studies that have sought out these voices and have actually interviewed individuals, both youth and adults with FASD. And I've just picked out a few of the key findings that I wanted to share that I thought would be interesting to caregivers. One of the themes that emerges in this research is the sense of helplessness among youth and adults with FASD in terms of being stuck in the system, and in terms of not necessarily feeling like the system is set up to help them succeed. Some of the research that I'm referring to was conducted with youth who are in a detention situation, and they underwent FASD assessment. And there were some really mixed experiences around this assessment process. So for example, some youth found that it was really confusing, and it was really hard for them to grasp what the implications of the assessment were, both in terms of what it meant for them and how they function, but also what it meant in terms of how it was going to change the next steps in terms of their experience with the justice system. And some more really important research has been conducted on the perspectives of adults who are involved in the justice system in terms of risks and protective factors. So by this, I mean factors that adults feel primed them to be involved in the system in the first place, factors that hindered them once they were involved in the system, but also some really important factors for supporting them to exit from the system. And this relates to some really important work that's been done on protective factors for people with FASD. So there's been some research to suggest that the presence of protective factors are actually associated with lower rates of recidivism in youth with FASD. And so examples of these might be pro-social involvement or strong social support networks. Other factors that have been identified as protective are more individual factors. So an individual's experience of hope, willingness to change, and resilience, and this strong sense of cultural identity have all been linked with more positive outcomes for youth who are involved with the justice system. And finally, some earlier work that was conducted in the US, researchers found that having an early FASD diagnosis, staying in school, having lower rates of substance use, being in that stable and nurturing home environment, and having access to FASD specific supports were all associated with lower rates of contact with the justice system later in life. And so this work on resilience and protective factors is really important in that it can inform our efforts to design and implement interventions for people with FASD. Now, there are a number of intervention programs and models that I have highlighted here, and I just want to first note that there is really a lack of research in this area. We know that interventions are needed and that they need to be more tailored and appropriate for people with FASD. So the Manitoba Youth Justice Program is one example of a program that incorporates an FASD-informed approach. And in this program, the goals are to provide diagnostic services to youth who come into contact with the justice system. Based on the assessment, recommendations are provided to the judiciary. And another goal is to build community capacity and family capacity and more appropriate FASD-informed services and supports for these youth. There is not a lot of outcome data from this program, but some preliminary evaluation research on some of the elements of the program suggests that the program is related to, in some cases, reduced recidivism. The Alberta Advocacy Model is a legal aid program here in Alberta, and again, it's a wraparound approach for youth who are involved in the justice system, and the program provides FASD-specific training and multidisciplinary supports to youth who are involved in the program. The Alexis Justice Program is another Alberta program, and this program is specifically for adults. It is a partnership between a local First Nations community and an FASD clinical service network. And in this program, clients who are suspected of having FASD are referred for assessment, and then the clinical team provides recommendation to the court in terms of how the court could respond a bit more appropriately and effectively to the individual. And again, limited data on this program, but preliminary evidence suggests that service providers who are working in the program perceive it to be making really positive impacts. The Manitoba FASD Court is a newer, more innovative program here in Canada as well. And although there is not any research or outcome data from this program, I just wanted to highlight it as a really innovative program because I think that it's a good example of how we can adapt the court process to more appropriately and effectively meet the needs of people with FASD who are going through the courts. And finally, researchers in Australia have done a bit of work on diversionary pathways, and this is a model specifically for Indigenous youth. And the priority of this model is to divert youth back into the community rather than them becoming enmeshed in the adult system. And this model, although there is no outcome data from this model, one of the important elements is that it is delivered in a very culturally sensitive way for these youth.
Thanks, Katie. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the system level and everyday challenges that I think contribute to this ongoing challenge experienced by many individuals with FASD, as well as some opportunities and areas that I think attention can be drawn towards achieving better successes moving forward. So several challenges, I think, as I've mentioned throughout, contribute at the systems level or more broadly to not only the overrepresentation of people with FASD in the criminal justice system, but often trajectories that we hear described as really being a revolving door, where they may have an initial contact with police that becomes more formal charges that may result in community-based sanctions, followed by perhaps a short stay or a longer stay in a correctional institution, followed by release, and then difficulties meeting conditions of release and supervision, and that beginning all over again. So what are some of those challenges? First, I think there's a major challenge in terms of under-recognition of individuals with a disability. This can be complicated and challenging for a number of reasons in general, irrespective of thinking about individuals' engagement in the criminal justice system specifically. For instance, only roughly 10% of people with FASD present with outwardly discernible or easily observed overt physical features, such as some of the facial features associated with prenatal alcohol exposure. We also know from some of those research studies I shared with you early in the presentation in correctional and forensic institutions that most people who participated in those research studies had never been previously identified as having FASD, which is a major concern given the high rates of difficulties and support needs that individuals with a disability have, and the lost opportunity really to provide early supports and opportunities for intervention to promote healthy outcomes for those folks. Another contributing factor, I think, relates to sort of lack of awareness or knowledge or training and skill, and then experience supporting and understanding the needs of people with FASD in clinical and legal professions and in criminal justice contexts. So a good number of studies over the last decade indicate that while awareness about FASD amongst justice professionals, including those working in correctional institutions, for instance, lawyers and others, is increasing, and we know that many now have basic knowledge about FASD, such as what the disability is and why it might be relevant to the criminal justice system, many lack more sort of detailed or in-depth specific knowledge about how to actually work with folks who have the disability most effectively and support their needs. We actually just completed a study looking at understanding sort of knowledge, experience, and needs around FASD in clinical forensic mental health professionals, and found that the majority had had experience working with individuals who may have FASD in court-ordered or other kinds of legally related assessments or treatment and intervention contexts. But the vast majority reported feeling undertrained and ill-equipped and not having sufficient knowledge to really meet the needs of those clients in the way that they would like to, and really strongly endorse the need and desire to have more training to support more competent and better practice in those areas. And that's what we see across many studies. There's also important work coming out of Australia suggesting that targeted training for justice professionals focusing on FASD can make a really significant and important impact, not only on their knowledge, but also based on participant reports on their confidence in terms of better being able to support youth with the disability. In addition to under recognition and limited knowledge and training, more broadly, there's a really limited opportunity to actually have a diagnosis of FASD in Canada. The number of diagnostic spots broadly across populations are limited, and there's very, very limited opportunity for a justice-specific opportunity to have the disability recognized. And there may not be a funded opportunity for individuals involved in justice to have FASD identified and diagnosed in that context. Lots of this boils down to insufficient funding and resources across levels to support diagnostic programs, training for professionals and staff, to support the implementation of FASD-specific service provision or resources. And this can be a real challenge and is a really critical gap in the literature. There's very little research to tell us what's most helpful in the criminal justice and forensic context around treatment and intervention to support positive outcomes more broadly, as well as to reduce recidivism and help support individuals away from engagement in the criminal justice system and offending. And this is a really critical area of need because we need to understand whether programs that are specific to FASD or other kinds of programs with accommodations put into place, what kinds of interventions are going to be most helpful in that respect. Another barrier that has been reported focuses on communication, both between systems and also across systems. So this is one that's often referred to as a siloing. And we've had lots of folks share with us the challenges they've experienced in terms of having challenges with information sharing and privacy between the criminal justice, health, and education and other kinds of systems. And also sometimes even within systems. For instance, sometimes information gleaned in an FASD assessment that is undertaken prior to going to court, after court, might not be accessible to individuals actually tasked with providing treatment or managing and supervising somebody with FASD who's progressing through the system. And these barriers can, though, need to be navigated cautiously in supporting people's privacy rights and making sure that health information and other kinds of information are not being shared at the wrong times, but also may be really critical in helping provide the most continuous support for individuals with complex needs like those with FASD. So what are some of the priorities and opportunities that I think might help improve outcomes for individuals with FASD, focusing on the criminal justice context moving forward? Well, first, I think identification is critical. I think identifying and recognizing and, if appropriate, diagnosing somebody with FASD and really importantly, understanding the kinds of needs and difficulties they experience in all areas of their functioning, for instance, in their neurodevelopmental functioning, in their educational functioning, in their health and their physical health functioning and mental health functioning, and potentially accessing FASD diagnostic resources is critical. And one of the ways that that can be improved and supported is by implementing evidence-based screening programs, as well as by increasing knowledge about FASD in a range of settings and professionals, so that individuals who are supporting kiddos with a variety of complex needs are better able to identify children who may be at risk of having the disability and right now are going missed. And that brings me to my next point, which is really thinking about being proactive and trying to provide appropriate supports and support healthy development and healthy outcomes, and hopefully avoid running into conflict with the criminal justice system and legal conflict altogether. We know that there are a wide range of early interventions and supports for children with a range of kinds of difficulties and experiences related to their mental health functioning, and other kinds of programs and supports that can help bolster and support families and caregivers in taking care of kiddos and having healthy families. And sometimes we talk about focusing on the criminal justice system as being at the very long end of a journey that really required more supports proactively early on to avoid that area of difficulty from occurring altogether. We've talked a little bit about how limited FASD diagnostic spaces can be, and so seeking out other kinds of psychological and or forensic legally relevant assessments if you have a child who, or a young person or adult, or you are yourself an adolescent or adult with FASD who's experiencing these kinds of difficulties, having a psychological assessment, an assessment of your cognitive functioning or neuropsychological assessment, or forensic assessment by somebody trained to sort of understand the factors related to somebody experiencing difficulties with offending and being able to make helpful recommendations to support those unique needs can be very important in ensuring that needs and avenues for support that can improve outcomes are identified, not only for an individual with FASD and their care providers and family, but also for the courts and other criminal justice and forensic professionals. I think that individuals with FASD and their care providers, families, and others who have this better developed or advanced level knowledge about FASD, it's really critical to continue to work to continue advocating as educators to ensure that clinicians and legal professionals who may be engaging with someone with FASD, an adolescent or an adult, really understands what FASD is all about, and that will continue to be really important as knowledge and skill increases with increasing awareness and training for these professional groups. And for individuals working in criminal justice and forensic mental health systems who may themselves not feel adequately equipped or trained to identify and support individuals with FASD, it can also be very helpful to reach out and consult experts and experienced experts, individuals with lived experience, care providers, and individuals themselves to get informed and to get input on cases to ensure that they're being approached through an FASD informed lens. So some of the take-home messages that I hope we were able to share with you today is that FASD in the criminal justice system is a major public health issue that requires resources, research, policy change, and all kinds of supports to really best enhance and improve outcomes for individuals with FASD in this context. The types of experiences and needs or trajectories through the criminal justice system that are experienced by individuals with FASD are dynamic and unique to each individual. They're marked by risk factors linked with increasing the chances of having difficulties in this area, and also by resilience and protective factors, and being able to leverage and harness these and strengths can help support improved outcomes. Assessment and individualized supports we know can really bolster these protective factors and resilience and help build positive trajectories beyond or exiting the criminal justice system. But that broadly at a systems level, in order to support individuals and families, responses really do need to be intersectoral, where different kinds of systems who are responding to the complex difficulties experienced by youth or adults who are justice involved with FASD, and collaborative, tailored to their unique profile of strengths and difficulties, and evidence-based, and a little bit of flexibility and creativity, as I'm sure many of you are aware and have experienced, can really also go a long way in terms of trying to support healthy outcomes. So I'd like to take a brief moment to acknowledge some of our collaborators, the participating clinics who are involved in the Dataform resource that I shared with you earlier, those who have funded the research that we talked about today, and also you for the invitation and the opportunity to be here and to hear us speak. And as I understand it at this stage, we'll be able to answer questions and have a live Q&A. And anyone who has questions about our slides or questions about the data we presented or about the topic in general, they're very welcome to get in touch with myself or Katy. Our email addresses are shared here. We're happy to check in and provide resources, or feel free to ask a question now as we take over to the live portion of our presentation today.
Yes. Again, we just want to thank Dr. Flannigan, Dr. McLachlan for joining us here today. I think a couple of the key takeaways that I certainly took from this was I very much appreciated the fact that you gave us a lot of positive outcomes and a lot of really where the solutions lie, and really made your focus on that. I think the big thing that I saw was what we could do right now. Maybe the key aspect is really around that education piece. We're hearing a lot of folks, you know, they recognize that we need to do something here, but we're not sure how to go about in doing that, what we need to be doing. Certainly that collaboration piece around best practices. I love the fact, Katy, that you brought in some of those other provinces and what they're doing in Alberta, what they're doing in Manitoba. Certainly from our standpoint, we recognize that CanFASD is a wonderful partner from our standpoint. We are aware that we don't currently have an Ontario organization or ministry that's renewed a membership with them. So that would certainly be something that we would love to see change going forward, because we're going to need to have access to that research. And in fact, even that, I know about that course that you guys did for justice and legal professionals and the solicitor general professionals out in Alberta. And certainly that would help with the knowledge capacity.